Late in 1895, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen first noticed the strange effect which led to the announcement of his discovery of X-ray.
They remained a mystery even to the scientists. That is how they got their name, X for the unknown.
All right, welcome back everyone to Catheter Jockeys. We have a very, very special edition today, and I'm accompanied with a few other familiar names. We got Reese from Collaboration RA. Say hi, Reese.
Hello.
There's your famous intro, and then also another familiar face, Prof. B in the house. How we doing, Kristen?
Oh, hey, how's it going?
Long time no chat. Thank you again for being here with us. Now, for the very, very, very special guest, we have a New York Times bestselling author with us. We have Kate Moore. Kate is the author of The Radium Girls. Some of you listeners out there may be very familiar with. She's a New York Times bestseller author, and she's written multiple other titles. Kate, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me to come along.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I know I stumbled upon your book at our public library, and it was actually at a section where you could actually purchase the book for yourself. And the book was actually up front and center. And I was like, I have to read this because it spoke to me. It has radiation all over it. So I picked it up, I purchased it, brought it home.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was, and I guess I don't judge a book by the cover because I was only about halfway through the book when my wife pointed out, she goes, "Why are you reading the Young Readers Edition?" And I was like, I didn't know it was a Young Readers Edition. So there's apparently is it two different versions to the book? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. There was the original, I guess you would say adult version, but actually a lot of high schoolers read it as well. And then we did subsequently a young readers edition, which is allegedly targeted at 8 to 12-year-olds, but it's fine. Anyone can read it. And what it really is a kind of simplified, shortened version. So there's fewer characters, and it's aimed for people that don't really want to get into the sort of deep dive of it.
I love this moment for you, Reese, right now.
Thank you.
I love this moment for you.
Yeah.
Reese is like, why is y'all's books different? I'm like, Reese, your book looks a lot shorter.
But what I love is that you've got
there's
so
way
much
more
out of the
pictures.
story. There are more pictures. Actually, there is a lot more pictures in the Young Readers Edition. Like, I was really excited when I was asked to do it because I got to include, things like business cards, different contracts of the Radium Girls with their lawyers. Like, there's so much more material, like the original material in the Young Readers Edition than there is in the adult version. So, you get, there's the pluses and minuses to both editions.
Wow. See, now I'm a little jealous. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm still feeling left out. One, because I'm not reading the rated R version, but
for PG-13.
Yeah, I'm reading the PG-13. Yeah, 8 to 12.
You're G-rated. It's 8 to 12, which is not even PG-13.
Well, regardless of which version I'm reading,
it was a good read.
It was a very good read. It was a tremendous, excellent read. I really enjoyed it, and that's why I called up Rosie. I called Rosie, and I was like, "Hey, I have a great topic for a Catheter Jockeys episode for you." And he goes, "Okay, what's up?" I was like, "You got to talk about the Radium Girls. It's a piece of solid history. It's relatable to our field, and it implemented a lot of change as a result of what they went through." And he goes, "You know what? Sounds like it's going to be a great episode, but you're going to be the one to put it on. You're going to be the one to produce it. So do the legwork." I was like, "Set it up." I was like, "Okay." And so I actually reached out to you, Kate, at that point, and I emailed you, and I waited, and about a week later, you replied back saying, "Podcast sounds fun. Let's do it." And so,
which is awesome.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on and joining us. That's exciting. I know Rosie would really like to be here himself. I feel like I've been given the keys to a Lambo to take the Catheter Jockeys podcast out for a spin and really mash on the throttle. So I'm excited to see what we can do for this episode. What about you, Prof?
So Rosie is a great friend of mine now, and he sent me the most amazing gift this week. It arrived this week. The timing was impeccable, and it is a clock dial with radium. So
wow.
he got this from France. Me and my kids immediately took it in the bathroom, turned off all the lights. It truly glows in the dark. I took it to work. My Geiger counter totally started firing. So it's a true radium clock dial. And I've been teaching about the Radium Girls for 10 years. It's something like when the Netflix show came out, when the movie came out, we did like a screening, and it's just something I've always been so interested in. As you can see, I love Marie Curie. Marie Curie is my great woman of science, in my opinion. I'm a female scientist, and there's not a ton of us out there. And Marie Curie really set the field. And so learning about the Radium Girls and learning about the sacrifice that they made for radiation safety, occupational health, and really just kind of the sharing of information across networks, because a lot of these things were happening individually in different geographic areas. It's just amazing. And so to meet somebody who dedicated such a huge chunk of their life to researching and then telling not just the story of what happened, but the experience of the individuals that lived it. It's just such an honor to meet you, and I could not be more happy to be here today.
Oh, thank you so much. That's beautiful words. And it's always weird for me when people say things like that, because this was such a passion project for me. And for me, like, the honor is that I get to have dedicated my life to researching the story of the Radium Girls. You know, this is the greatest privilege of my life, that I actually got to meet their families and visit their graves and really delve into their medical records, you know, and to be able to give them a voice back. You know, this for me is the honor. You know, I'm honored to be talking to you guys about it, because my sort of mission in writing the Radium Girls was to ensure that these special women were remembered and celebrated and honoured. And the fact that we're all talking about them tonight is just incredible to me. It still feels like spine tingling that we're helping to keep their memories alive through this conversation this evening.
Amazing.
Yeah, it truly is an honor. And so one of the things that I was really curious about is going through the book, the in-depth amount of personal stories and accounts that you had. How were you able to track down and, get these stories and from family members? And can you kind of just take us through your research process on how things went?
Yeah, it was, as I think is often the way with any research project, you know, there's different routes for different sources. So I was really indebted to previous authors who'd written on the subject, Claudia Clark and Dr. Ross Molnar. They both had excellent bibliographies that pointed me to different libraries and things like that. I was gifted by the fact that there were major legal cases, which meant that the lawyers had, particularly in the case of the New Jersey women, the lawyers had left their legal records to the Library of Congress. And those records included correspondence from the women. They included a huge, wads of newspaper cuttings with first-person interviews from the girls. It had the court testimonies in there. It had their medical records, including in one case X-rays that I could actually see. They were on the microfilm at the Library of Congress. So part of it was delving into the libraries, visiting different special collections that they have. For example, Harrison Martland, who may be a familiar name to some of your listeners. He was the doctor who sort of joined the dots between this, never before seen radiation poisoning and making the connection between the dial painters' jobs and the radiation poisoning that they were suffering. He was the one that made that groundbreaking discovery and solved this medical mystery. He has a special collection at Rutgers University. So again, was able to delve through those letters, his writings, his medical publications. And then the more personal things came from different sources. Some of them, for example, Catherine Sharp, one of the key Radium girls, she herself was a writer. She published an extract of her autobiography in a little known publication that ended up at the Library of Congress. So I could read her memoir and quote from her first person words. There were lots of letters, there were lots of newspaper interviews, there were lots of court testimonies. And then there were also the family members that I tracked down. And some of them had spoken to the press before. So in my case, it was reaching out to local papers and saying, 10 years ago, you spoke to the niece of Peg Looney. Is there any chance you can please connect me with her? And other things were literally, I would find an obituary that said this person had a brother, and then I'd look up the brother. Well, he was dead, but he had a daughter. So I was like a sort of, trying to follow the trail basically, and then literally randomly emailing people. Catherine Donahue's great niece, who I reached out to and was such a key contributor of the book. I literally emailed her at work.
Awesome.
She was an estate agent at the time, and I was like, "Hi, I'm this British writer. I want to write a book about your great aunt." And she could not have been more helpful, because it was such a weird email for her to receive. Like, I could have been anyone. But as it was, we met up. She took me to visit her uncle in a care home. We went out for lunch. She connected me with an incredible source, the niece of Catherine Donoghue, who was 13 when Catherine was sick, was often in the house, who, knew the family really, really well, who had actual visceral memories of seeing her aunt on her deathbed. I couldn't have had access to all that, personal, intimate knowledge without the family's assistance. So they were incredible, absolutely incredible in sharing their family stories with me.
It's kind of amazing as you're talking about kind of the family sharing the story and the family watching people on the deathbed. It reminds me so much of Henrietta Lacks. So the story of Henrietta Lacks is her cells were stolen from her. She had a very aggressive type of cervical cancer. I believe it was cervical cancer or uterine cancer. And just recently, like a couple of weeks ago, her family was finally given a settlement as retribution for the pain that she suffered, and the fact that the entire world relies on these culture cells that were stolen from this woman without her knowledge. And, so many of those things happened even after we had the Nuremberg trials and after we had ethical codes of research. There were still so many times where, the people that really contributed the evidence to the story were not honored. So I'm seeing so many parallels of kind of the stories between these two women.
Absolutely, and I've heard that before. And in fact, when the book was first published in America, that so many librarians made that connection as well.
Were you talking about the HeLa cells?
Yeah, the HeLa cells.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Oh yeah. Yeah. That poor family.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
I feel so bad for him. Prof B, I think you're the educator of the group. So take us through what radium is.
So radium is a particulate type of radiation. So there's basically two types of radiation. In X-ray, we use electromagnetic radiation, and that is in a wave form. So it has wave particle duality in that it exhibits properties of particulate matter, but it doesn't really take up space the same way that matter does. And it travels in waves, and it basically has to be created. The other type of radiation that we focus on is particulate radiation. And if you're in X-ray, you're focused on electromagnetic spectrum. If you're in nuclear medicine, you're focused on particulate radiation, where somebody is ingesting something. So particulate radiation is something that emits radiation on its own. It doesn't take kVp, it doesn't take current, it doesn't take amperage, it doesn't take any of that stuff to create it. It just emits radiation on its own. And the way that we measure that is usually in becquerels, or we used to measure it in Curie as a way to kind of honor Marie Curie and her discovery of radium. But the particulate radiation is typically more dangerous because it exists for an indefinite amount of time based on its radioactive decay. So radium is particulate radiation. It is a type of matter that emits radiation on its own without any type of external source. So it's a particulate source. It emits radiation, and it emits radiation continuously based on its half-life. Its half-life is the amount of time that it takes to emit half of the radioactivity that it contains. So radium is really dangerous because its half-life is 1,600 years, which means it takes 3,200 years for one particle of radium to emit all of the radiation that it has. In perspective, the radioactive pharmaceuticals that we use in nuclear medicine, they typically have half-lives of 48 to 72 hours. So while you are exposed to a type of radiation that is similar to radium, if you have a nuclear medicine study, it degrades so much faster. So in 48 to 72 hours, you are no longer radioactive. And so that's why those are kind of approved for nuclear medicine studies, whereas something like radium or uranium, those very long-living, long half-life of decay type of elements, they're much more destructive. And typically now they're used in like nuclear warfare for those reasons.
Mm-hmm.
That is such an eloquent description. Like, it was a pleasure for me to hear that, because people always ask about, what is radium, and because I'm not a scientist, I always panic at that moment. So thank you for that beautiful response.
Oh my God, I feel so honored for you to say that.
That's why she's a professor.
That's why.
Yeah.
That's why she.
That's why I'm proud to be, I feel like I was made to be a teacher, so I can't dog on it too much. My dad is a teacher. My mom worked for a school district as superintendent. It's like in my genes.
Yeah, I would have been like, it's like a radioactive metal that will hurt you a lot.
It's like a thing. It's like a thing. Yeah. It's bad for you. You don't eat it.
Okay, so
did you guys know that barium is actually the most closest alkaline metal that we use that is similar to radium?
I'm sorry, I did not know that, John. Can you please explain further?
Well, when I was researching radium, they constantly were comparing barium to radium because they have the same weight makeup. And radium is actually the only alkaline metal that is radioactive. We all know barium, as far as we know, as far as now, is inert and doesn't really hurt us. Just turns our stool weird gray and white colors,
ashy white, yeah,
when we ingest it. So thankfully that we have very smart scientists that discovered that is radioactive, and that's not the stuff we're drinking for our fluoroscopy exams.
Okay, now I'm gonna have to go down the rabbit hole, John, because I'm gonna have to tell my students.
Don't ask me too many questions.
That's awesome. I don't care. You just planted a seed in the garden of
I
my
was
brain.
like, oh, I can pull this into how we use this daily. So,
and only in this scenario would that be like a great conversation piece.
Mm-hmm.
Very few people would be interested
anywhere
in
else.
that. And
anywhere else.
Isn't that the great thing of radiology?
You're like, that periodic table where it's got a whole bunch of things and words you don't understand. Well, these two are like each other.
All those letters.
And they're next to each other on the table for a reason, and this is why.
I love it.
I think it's very important to keep our listeners informed about what we're talking about, because obviously we all know what we're talking about. That's why we're chatting so much about it. What is a radium girl?
So the radium girls were what they called dial painters. And this was a profession that sort of came to be in the First World War and just before the First World War began. And the women were employed to paint the numbers on dials, clocks, watches. They also painted other items as well with this glow-in-the-dark radium paint. As it suggests, the glow-in-the-dark radium paint was radioactive. And the girls were taught a specific technique by their employers called lip pointing. Because the dials that they were painting were so small and the numbers were so tiny, they had to be really, really precise in getting their brushes to paint these tiny, tiny numbers. So they were taught to lick their brushes, to sort of put them between their lips to make a fine point so it would taper to a point. And so they dip it in the paint suck on it and then paint the numbers on the watches. So the radium girls were the women who painted glow-in-the-dark watches and clocks with this glow-in-the-dark radium paint. And they were taught to lip point, which meant they were swallowing tiny amount of the radium paint on every dial that they painted.
And I know I read in the book that some of the painters would make hundreds of dials a day. You know, they were paid per dial, which was an incentive, you know, kind of like we have quotas today, or an incentive to paint more. And so typically the ones who were very high performing in the company by making a lot of dials were the ones who got sicker faster and succumbed to their injuries faster.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right.
I think I read they get paid like 1.5 cents per dial, which I think it like translated like 35 cents in today's time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that's sort of part of the tragedy of the story is it was seen as this incredible profession for several reasons. I mean, number one, we've described that it's artistic. You know, you were sort of joking earlier about colouring being a sort of,
exactly.
restful therapy. But actually, if you think, of all the different jobs that you could do, actually going to work and painting, it's a beautiful thing to do. The women got to be artistic. They got to work with this glowing wonder substance. Everyone was obsessed with radium in the 1910s and 1920s. It was headline news. It was sung about in music halls. As I say, there were all these different products in drugstores, and the women, because particularly the skilled workers, as you say, they were paid by the number of dials they painted, but the most skilled workers were in the top 5% of female wage earners nationally. They were taking home the equivalent of about $40,000 annually. So the girls also got to dress in, furs and silks, and, they also got covered in the sort of glowing dust from the paint, from going into the studio. And, the women I write about remembered how they'd wear their good dresses to the plant, so that when they went out dancing after work, the radium girls, you could literally spot them a mile off. Yeah, they'd be dazzling. They'd be glowing. So the tragedy is that it was seen as such an incredible job. It was lucrative, it was glamorous, it was artistic. When I looked up the women in the town directories, when you see them and it's got like name, address and their profession, and it says what their job title is. And it doesn't say dial painter or radium girl, it says artist. That's literally how they define themselves in their town directories, was artist. So, and of course, it's such a tragedy because they think it's such a great job. If there are vacancies, particularly in the wartime boom, they're promoting the jobs to their sisters, to their cousins, to their friends, anyone they love. They're like, come along, this is incredible, come and work here. And of course, we know now in the modern day, tragedy is waiting down the line. And that for me was one of the heartbreaking things about the story, is that it starts with such joy and a feeling of luck and being blessed. And actually, with every dial that they're painting, every time they're putting their brush in their mouth, they are sealing their own fate. Yeah, but they just don't know it.
I know. I was reading reviews on your book from other kind of book clubs that had commented on it, and one thing that stuck with me was like the lip dip and paint. Someone said it was lip dip and dye, and I was just like, wow, that's just the fact that they know that they're slow. Well, now that we know, they're slowly killing themselves with each and every lick of the paintbrush is disturbing to think of,
Yeah. There was a really haunting cartoon. I think it was in 1926 that American Weekly did a piece on them. And it was like a black and white line drawing of the girls sitting at their studio painting. And there was them, and then there was a sketch of death, with the scythe and the sort of hood just there, like opposite them, waiting while they're doing the dial. It's really, really chilling illustration.
Wow.
Yeah, it's as much as they contributed to radiation safety, their story contributed to occupational safety as a whole. So much, many of the OSHA standards, like right now in our departments for anything radioactive, we have an MSDS sheet or a material safety data sheet, and none of that really existed at that time. And now we know retroactively that the message that the companies were giving the girls about radiation, or about radium in general, was inaccurate. So it's really crazy to be in such a regulated world as far as occupational safety now, but to see less than 100 years ago just how different it was.
Yeah, and towards the end, at least with the Ottawa girls, when they formed the Society of the Living Dead, I thought that was a very fitting name, and that the doctors and Grossman, the lawyer, carrying on these girls' legacies and kind of really sparking the research and in-depth look into the practice of radium dial painting and kind of making a stand for it. One of the other things was the part about the Manhattan Project, when the guy was like, I see what's happening to these radium girls, and I know what radium is, and the radioactive isotopes that we're using in developing the atomic weapons, and the safety standards that they implemented to protect their workers because of how much they closely were working, was kind of shocking too. And it's like, why, if this guy saw it and he was an expert, why weren't the experts with the radium dial companies on the same page? And it's a shame that it was profits over people. Once again, that happens. So
yeah. As you say, the only sort of blessing from it is that the sacrifice did mean something, in the sense that, all of you guys are protected today because of what they went through, because of what they went through. The guy on the Manhattan Project, Seaborg, he said, no, we need to put safety standards in place for our people. We need to do tests to see if our isotopes are acting in a similar way to the radium. And of course they were, if the radium girls hadn't gone through what they've gone through, and not only that, but brought it to public attention through persevering with the legal fight for justice and so on, because obviously the initial women that died, they were very quickly on death certificates that had nothing to do with their jobs. It
syphilis.
It was about,
oh my gosh,
syphilis or
diphtheria.
The shame, and at the time, shame.
It's not just about what they went through. It's the fact that they persevered through their pain to bring it to public attention, and thanks to that, these safety standards were put in place across all nuclear industries, and as you say, the legal fight more generally also protected workers beyond that, in terms of legislation changing, widening the sort of net in terms of what could be compensated for workers wise, rewriting laws to protect workers, even just being one of the first cases where an employer was held responsible for the health of their employees. These are all groundbreaking moments in the wider workers' rights and sort of safety standards movement. They've had a huge impact within the radiation industries, but it also goes beyond that as well.
We learned so much from it too, because then in World War II, 20 years later, or roughly 20 years later, we were using uranium. So what we learned about radium, we were using uranium on the tips of bullets to cause, so that was during the Cold War, but we were using uranium for the nuclear bombs that the US dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then later on, we were using uranium tipped bullets. And part of that, sadly, came from the knowledge that we learned about radium from the Radium Girls. So it's kind of like a paradox of learning how to protect ourselves, but also weaponizing it on the other side when we know the destruction it causes. So it's kind of crazy. And now Oppenheimer's out and all of these things, and the Manhattan Project is being highlighted. But the reason we chose uranium bombs is because of the continuous incineration that it caused. And while the radiation caused so many problems, the fires that broke out in Hiroshima caused just as much destruction, if not more. And we knew that that was coming. And it's kind of crazy. That's one of the things that I focus a lot on is forensics as part of my research, and just kind of learning that it can be weaponized so easily too. Like, knowledge is power, and at the same time, in the wrong hands, it goes so differently. Kind of
very well said.
Sad, not to put a damper on the
bittersweet,
pod,
yeah.
Way to bring us down, Prof.
I know. I'm so sorry. I'm so depressing. One of the other parallels.
Reese, quick, talk about your coloring books.
Also depressing. one of the parallels of why the Radium girls really suffered for so long is there was not kind of interstate communication. And the same thing happens in law enforcement. We didn't share information across state lines until the 1980s, 1990s. And so that's why serial killers like Ted Bundy got away with so many crimes. It's because he was in so many different states in a short period of time, and we didn't share information. So now we have big data. We share information all the time.
Yeah, it's data driven's our world now. Yeah.
Yeah, I say data is my love language because I'm such a data nerd. But hopefully we learn to share the data in a way that is meant to protect us, and that we do it in an ethical way that, only advances humanity rather than destroys it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So sad. I'm sorry. I'm such a damper. I'm like, what's that character on SNL? Debbie Downer.
Yeah.
Debbie
Debbie Downer.
That's me. Prof B Downer.
No, I mean, but it's the truth. And
It's
so, yeah,
valid,
that's what,
yes.
we're trying to share and bring awareness to.
Hola, Rosie here, co-host of the Catholic Jockeys. You guys have been listening to a very special episode. It's so special that I've decided to make it a two-parter. Is it because of the algorithm? No. Is it because of more downloads? No. It's actually because I know you guys, like myself, have a very short attention span or a very short drive to work. So stop thinking about it and just go to part 2. And thank you for listening to part 1.